So over the last few weeks, I've been watching all the other movies in this franchise as I wanted to make sure that I was prepared before I saw this. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel. Today we're talking about a brand new Netflix release, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on this movie were, if you already saw it, or if you were planning on seeing it, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases, older films, hidden gems, and so much more on a near daily basis. But let's not waste any more time and let's talk about Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This sees Leatherface return after nearly 50 years of hiding to terrorize a group of idealistic young friends who accidentally disrupt his carefully shielded world in a remote Texas town. This is directed by David Blue Garcia with a screenplay by Chris Thomas Devlin, though the screen credit goes to Fede Alvarez and Rodo Sayagas, the minds behind films like the Don't Breathe movies and the Evil Dead remake from 2013, and they co-produced this as well. And it sees something that's actually been done once before in this series, where it's a direct sequel to the 1974 movie, disregarding the events of everything that came after it. And though Fede Alvarez has walked those comments back a bit, saying it's left open to interpretation, whatever that means, it's either they're canon or they're not. This is the second film after Texas Chainsaw 3D to make it so that you only need to see the original film and nothing else. Texas Chainsaw 3D did it at a time where the requel, as it's called, wasn't so popular, and it didn't exactly revitalize the franchise. But now that Halloween 2018 brought new life to that subgenre, now this franchise wants to get back on it proper, especially considering 3D was not well received at all, getting some of the series' worst reception, and rightfully so. Though if you think about it, none of these films have ever been well received critically besides the first one, and even then, that was only in retrospect. When it comes to every other entry in the Texas Chainsaw franchise, the only ones who really speak glowingly of any other entry are the longtime fans. And I've learned as I've gone through these movies that you're going to get a wildly different answer on which ones are actually the misunderstood ones, depending on who you ask. There are a couple that are all universally hated by fans, but beyond those, everyone's pretty divided on where they stand with the remainder, with each entry having their own followings, despite having just as many people saying they hate the movie. And the same goes for this one. Once again, this hasn't received the most glowing reception for a Texas Chainsaw movie, and you have fans either calling it one of the best entries or one of the worst entries in the series. Now, as for me, I will say, I'm a bit newer to this franchise as a whole. I've only seen 2 of these movies prior to watching all of them in the lead up to this, and even then, the original isn't one of my favorite horror movies of all time or anything. So something to keep in mind is I'm not a longtime fan of this franchise. And that being said, I thought this was pretty alright. Like a lot of the previous entries, it's far from perfect. I wouldn't even call it great, but despite its noticeable flaws, which I'll get into shortly, I had a good enough time with it for what it was. I think the main thing for me here is that while it once again maintains the serious tone that you come to expect with these Texas Chainsaw movies, I actually found myself having a good bit of fun with it. Now, it's not campy or goofy or over the top necessarily, outside of the occasional joke, but as a slasher movie, it's fun for its use of the genre's most prominent element. One wording I heard someone say is that this puts the massacre in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I couldn't agree more with that sentiment. This is probably one of the bloodiest entries in this franchise. It takes a little bit to get going, but the minute we get to the first kill sequence taking place in this ambulance, I knew we were in for a pretty good time. And these sequences are pretty gnarly. The sound mixing really gives them these harsher sounds, there's a lot of creativity to each of these moments, and some will delve into absolute carnage. Most notably, the scene we get a little bit of in the trailer, that being the bus sequence. And if nothing else, if all you come to these movies for is to just see Leatherface wreaking havoc and you want to see a bunch of creative kill sequences, then I can't see you having that bad of a time with this. It essentially delivers on what we generally expect with these slasher movies, for better or worse. And for that, like I said, I had a good enough time with it. There's enough of these tension-filled sequences that I found this to be decent B-movie fun, which actually is something you don't get to say all too often with these movies in particular. The original 1974 film had a very grimy, eerie, dirty feel to it, and while several movies have deviated from that tone considerably, the ones that try to bring things back in go for a similar tone, albeit with a somewhat more polished look. And I don't mean that as a bad thing, as there have been a few instances where that worked. Though I'd place this a little more into one of the films that deviates from that initial film film's tone, while still keeping things fairly serious in terms of its story. And for me, while it might not be the true tone of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I felt it worked fine enough for what the movie was going for, so I really can't complain as far as that goes. Now, in terms of everything else, that's where I was a bit more mixed. The big thing being the characters. Now, if you've been following my other reviews of these films, I've made it clear that you don't exactly go to these movies, or really any other slasher movie, for rich, deep characterization. So if the character works thin in any of these films, I can accept it as long as there's just the bare minimum as far as making them likable and having somewhat of a personality, which unfortunately quite a few of these movies fail to do too, but that's a different story. This decides to take things a step further though, and in a rare move for this franchise, tries to make these characters have an arc. Here you have Sarah Yarkin as Mel and Jacob Lattimore as Dante, two friends who are also entrepreneurs trying to make an investment into this small town, attempting to impress a bunch of buyers and make it trendier, to the chagrin of the locals, in particular a mechanic named Richter, played by Mo Dunford, that winds up reluctantly working with them. And accompanying the two are Dante's girlfriend Ruth, played by Nell Hudson, and most prominently, Elsie Fisher as Mel's sister Lila. And throughout the first part of the film, we explore the various tensions between the friends and the town, as well as the tensions among all the friends themselves. The film tries to explore a number of topics, such as the effects of gentrification, with Mel having to reckon with the guilt of kicking a poor old woman out of her house early on, which winds up setting everything else into motion, and it even touches upon the subject of gun violence, as it's revealed Lila was the survivor of a school shooting and is now terrified of guns, which becomes important later on in a pretty obvious way. And this is all serviceable, though nothing to necessarily write home about. Now, I'll commend this film for trying to add a little more depth to these characters, because obviously that's what a lot of these movies get criticized for, is that they're thin on plot or characters, and everyone's essentially a body for whichever major villain it is. And to be clear, many entries in this series fall under that umbrella, even the original. So I do appreciate what this was trying to go for, but try as it might, I still wouldn't say the execution is the greatest. This is a mere 81 minutes long with credits, and simply put, that's just not enough time to explore all these topics and then still also be this mindless slasher with Leatherface causing absolute chaos. And sure enough, as a result, in some instances, it felt like we got half arcs for some of these characters. We'll revisit some of these tensions they have throughout the film, but a lot of them will come to a grinding halt because a character we were spending time with gets killed by Leatherface. Now, this time around, because we get a little deeper with these characters, it makes us care a bit more, even though there are still a few leads who do come off as completely unlikable. And something I've said in other reviews is that because these characters tend to feel just like bodies for Leatherface, I didn't always feel anything unless it's just a cool, really well done sequence, so this tries to give us a little something more to work with. But for the amount of time we devote to some of these arcs, only for them to get cut short, quite literally, it makes this a tad frustrating. There's still a fine line you need to walk if you're going to try for heavy character development in a slasher of all things, as you still want to make sure we don't wind up just wasting our time seeing a particular arc start developing and then it suddenly stops. If anything, I'd rather just see in these movies characters having much more memorable personalities than explore all these topics that might serve no purpose later on. But I will say, of everyone we follow, Elsie Fisher was great. I'd say she's the most likable of everyone, as she really wants no involvement with what her sister's doing and actually wants to move back home, and while her arc plays out in a way that you can pretty much see coming, I'd say it's the most satisfying of them all, with her performance also being the best among them all, though I did like Mo Dunford as well. And then, when it comes to several plot developments, I have to point out the thing that's been especially pointed out by everyone upon seeing the trailer, and that's its heavy comparisons to Halloween 2018. It might not wind up following the exact same beats as that film, but the similarities are way too obvious in several instances. One is the characterization of Leatherface himself. This is probably one of the most radical departures when it comes to this character. In previous films, Leatherface never really acted as the main villain. We've had movies that explore his origins, and he can be featured fairly prominently in others, but while Leatherface is who we most closely associate these movies with, in nearly every one of these films, he's essentially just this hulking figure with a mental disability who generally acts as the muscle for other members of his family who are the actual main villains. Here though, this sees Leatherface as the sole villain of the movie, and while the other films have slightly gone down this territory, this sees him going full-blown Jason Voorhees Michael Myers, like he's just a large, hulking figure with this chainsaw who walks around and stalks his victims before killing them. We even see him kind of acting a little calculating here, like he's thinking through his next move, which is something we almost never see with this character. This might actually be the smartest incarnation of Leatherface. Now, as someone who's not a die-hard fan of these movies, that didn't necessarily bother me quite as much. Now, on one hand, I do miss having that family dynamic as it makes things feel a little creepier and even a bit more out there. But considering all the chaos that ensues due to the way Leatherface is utilized, I didn't mind this approach so much, even if it's not the normal way he's portrayed. But it made for a decent enough trade-off. Though I can see longtime hardcore fans of these movies be particularly frustrated as far as that goes. And then the next big thing is the return of Sally Hardesty from the original, here played by Olin Fiore, who is also in Mandy, as Marilyn Burns unfortunately passed away some years ago. And her role is incredibly similar to Laurie Strode's return in Halloween 2018, where she's been preparing all her life for Leatherface to show back up, and she's become this hardened badass action hero. And she gets called in when she first hears the reports of his return. Now again, I'm mixed here, because on one hand, while we do get some pretty solid action scenes with Sally, the setup for her character runs so parallel to Laurie Strode's in Halloween 2018 that it's nearly impossible to not think of it almost anytime she's on screen. Like, even though they go down a bit of a different route with the character, I just could not separate the two. So when it comes to her, while there are some cool moments, I mainly saw a lack of originality, which was a bit troubling. Plus, she actually doesn't have quite as big of a role as you think she does. The trailer oversells how prominent she is in the movie. Now, it's not a glorified cameo necessarily, and I won't get into any spoilers, but she's not there from the very beginning, and it takes some time for her path and the rest of the characters' paths to converge. And unlike Laurie, she does not suddenly become the main character again upon her arrival. She acts mostly in support of these younger characters. So if you're a longtime fan of these movies and were eagerly awaiting for this new showdown between Sally and Leatherface, just temper your expectations as far as what to expect. So the issues here are fairly prominent, but my thing is, despite all that, I still managed to have fun with this movie. Its flaws are noticeable, and sometimes they can be a bit frustrating, but it also doubles down on a lot of its gory slasher thrills and tries to live up to its title. Probably more than a lot of these other entries, to be perfectly honest. And it does so in a very creative way. And because of how prominent that element is, while it doesn't make you able to completely look past its flaws, I'd say it balances things out just enough. Is Texas Chainsaw Massacre perfect? Not at all. But it does something we normally don't get with these movies, and it manages to go all in on having some B-movie fun, which can be for better or worse. The film has noticeable flaws, from its blatant similarities to Halloween 2018, to its attempts at character development that are either obvious or go absolutely nowhere. However, this does deliver on something most people come to slashers for, and that's seeing Leatherface wreak absolute havoc, and it does so in some of the most creative ways I've seen in this franchise in quite some time. So that, along with some solid performances to help make the sequences in between be somewhat intriguing, allowed the good to outweigh the bad enough for me, even if you can't completely ignore the bad. Texas Chainsaw Massacre gets a 6.5 out of 10. So, as I said, if you've been following me over the last few weeks, you'll know I've been reviewing each of the other Texas Chainsaw movies, and now that I've reviewed them all, stay tuned as I'll soon have a ranking video for this series on the way. But in the meantime, let me know, did you see Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Did you think this was one of the best in the franchise, one of the worst in the franchise, was it somewhere in the middle for you? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film.